Today I am in June Lake. June Lake is one of the mammoth lakes in the eastern Sierra, California. And today we're going to talk about the camera settings I use for my landscape photography. As you know, I like to keep things very simple. So we will go through 4 main settings, which are metering, exposure, focusing, and shooting. So follow me along and we will go through all these to make sure that our landscape photography will have the best camera settings possible. So the first camera setting I want to talk about is metering. How do I meter my landscape scenes? I mainly use 2 kinds of meterings: spot metering or matrix metering, which is the way Nikon calls the balance metering throughout the scene. I want to say that 90% of the time I will use the matrix metering. And I will use the spot metering just when I want to make sure that the light is right on a specific part of the scene. For instance, in my foreground. As a matter of fact, if I use a light meter and I meter the lower part of the scene, at f8 I will have 1/125 of a second. While if I meter the sky, at f8 I will have 1/1000. That's it, what the matrix metering will do. And the matrix metering at f8 will give me 1/320, which means it's trying to balance the light throughout the scene in order not to have the lower part of the scene too dark and not to have the sky too bright. Clearly, this image has a lot of dynamic range because there is a huge difference between the upper part of the scene and the lower part. So ideally, not only I want to use the matrix metering, but I also want to add a graduated neutral density filter, which is going to decrease the dynamic range of this image, making my sky look a little darker. Let's take a photo. So let me grab my filters. I like to use a polarized filter in order to reduce the glare on the water. And now, as I said, I like to darken the sky a little bit, and so I will use this filter, which is a graduated 3-stop neutral density filter, which has a soft edge. So I will place this filter in order to cover with the darker part the sky in my picture. So my exposure was 1/320. The light went down a little bit, but with the polarized and the graduated neutral density filter, my exposure at f8 is now 1/30. Okay, this is not a masterpiece, but it was just useful in order to let you see how to meter a scene with a very diverse lighting. And as you can see from the histogram, the matrix metering did a very good job because my histogram has actually most of the details in the middle. And it's not picking towards the highlights, it's not picking towards the shadows. But now I will move and find a different scene, a different composition, and talk about exposure. See you there. So it's the middle of the day. There's a very harsh light. So I take a break and I'm going to talk to you about exposure. The exposure triangle is made of 3 components. Your f-stop, so your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. For general landscape photography, I always set my camera in aperture priority, and I will tell you why. I want to be in full control of which aperture I will work with, because I often want to use apertures that are going between f8 or f11. I want to prioritize the sharpness in my images, and often your lenses will work at best in the mid-range of their maximum and minimum aperture. So for instance, in this 20mm lens, which has a maximum aperture of f1.8 and a minimum aperture of f22, the best performance will happen between f8 and f11. If instead I need a wider depth of field, I will then step down to possibly f16 or even f22 if the foreground is very close to my lens and I also have something very, very far away. The second component of the exposure triangle will be the ISO. And for the ISO, it's very simple. I will keep my ISO at the lowest native sensitivity possible. In my Nikon D810, the lowest sensitivity is ISO 64, and most of my images are taken at ISO 64. I want to have the minimum grain possible, the minimum noise possible, and so I rarely increase my ISO. And the third component of the exposure is the shutter speed. At this point, if I'm working with the aperture priority and I have a fixed ISO, the shutter speed will be whatever it is. And it's not going to make a big difference because most of my images are taken on a tripod. At the same time, if there are moving elements in your image, things will change a little bit. For instance, in my long exposure, if I want to emphasize the movement of the clouds or movements in the waves, then of course I will prioritize the shutter speed. But for general landscape photography, aperture priority, lowest ISO possible, and then use the shutter speed that you'll need. My scope here is to smoothen the water in order to get some reflections of the clouds into the water. Let's see what happens. When I'm here in the woods, I always look for bears. I just read the sign on the way here, don't feed our bears. And I really don't want to feed the bears. But this area is full of bears. I'm just cautious. In the end, there is a reason why on the California flag they put bear, I think. As you can tell, we have a lot of lakes in this area, and this one is named Horseshoe Lake. From here, I will be talking about focusing. And my preference for landscape photography is to focus through the viewfinder manually. The reason behind this is that if I use the live view mode and I use the display, I get distracted by other elements, and I feel that I'm able to focus more in my composition and do a better job in focusing if I look through the viewfinder. I prefer to do it manually for a few reasons. Often in landscape photography, the focus will fall into water or clouds, like in this scene, and so the autofocus will not work very well. Another thing is that I often do long exposure photography, so if I use the autofocus and then I forget to set my manual focus before putting my filters in front of the lens, the autofocus will be hunting focus. So I feel better off having manual focus start to finish. If you're focusing through the viewfinder, most of the cameras have a diopter adjustment. You want to make sure that that adjustment is right for your eyesight, because if that diopter adjustment is wrong, all your focus will be wrong. Waiting. Last lake and last setting of the day. Let's talk about shooting. You might say, do I need to have special settings for my shooting? Well, I say, if you've been following all this tutorial all the way through and you took care of all the settings until now, for sure you don't want to have a shaky image just because you didn't take care of the shooting. So I will tell you what is my preference. My preference is to use the mirror lockup, so that when I touch the shutter button for the first time, the mirror will actually move up and lock. And then when I touch the shutter button for the second time, at that point I'm taking the picture. For my long exposure though, I will actually use the remote shutter release for my second touch. So first time, mirror goes up, second time I take the picture. Now, if you don't have a remote shutter release and your camera doesn't have a mirror lockup, well, the solution is to use the self-timer. Just set your self-timer for 2 seconds, 3 seconds, whatever is convenient, and then you will touch the shutter button one time, and then the picture will happen a few seconds later. But at that point, you are sure you're not touching the camera, nothing will move, everything will be super steady. So this is all for today. I hope this video was useful to you and you learned something new. If you like this video, leave me a comment, share with your friends, hit the like button, and of course, if you didn't subscribe yet, I think it's the right time to do so. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.